So this is part two of our race, ethnicity, and equality, racial ethnic stratification chapter 9. And this part two is going to be introducing the concepts of majority and minority group. And along with that discussion, we will be talking about some of the primary concepts related to racism, privilege, prejudice, discrimination, stereotype, institutional discrimination. So, just a reminder, last part ended with the point that when we're talking about stratification, it's not necessarily about diversity, it's about inequality because it goes back to that image from chapter 7 and 8 when we introduced the concept of social stratification on the basis of class, where you have a ladder. At the top of the ladder, you have access to the good stuff. The good stuff is income, wealth, higher education, political power, social status. And so therefore, the higher the rung you are on the ladder, right, the better the access that you have to the good stuff. And different groups are on different ladders, and if the system is closed, you're stuck on the ladder. If the system, or you're stuck on your ladder rung, if it's open, you can move around. So with race, it's that same element, except instead of now it being a class system that we're discussing, we're talking about racial stratification. So the idea that some groups, some racial ethnic groups, are better positioned on that stratification ladder than others. And so we're going to introduce these concepts in this part, and then we will, in parts 3 and 4, kind of discuss the kind of historical underpinnings of this ladder placement of our major racial ethnic groups. So let's begin with the majority group. So what makes the majority group the majority? Here is what I want you to stick in your brains. The majority group does not necessarily need to be the numerical majority. In some cases, like here in America, where the majority group are whites of European descent, they are the numerical majority, but they don't necessarily have to be. And that's because the way we use this term in sociology is similar to the word dominant group, and that is another term for the majority group is dominant group. The reason why I don't personally use the term dominant group as much as I use the term majority group is because the opposite of majority group is minority groups. Which I feel a lot more comfortable saying than what the opposite of dominant group is, which is subordinate groups. And I think there is just something about the imagery for me associated with that word subordinate or subordination that leads me to not really use that term as much as I use majority group. However, if it helps you to remember that the majority group does not necessarily need to be the numerical majority, I strongly suggest somewhere in your notes you write down majority equals dominant, because then it'll help everything else that I'm about to say next make a lot more sense. So the majority group is a group that is advantaged in respect to other groups in terms of things like social status, education, employment, wealth, political power. What does it mean to say that they are advantaged in respect to other groups? It means that they have more than their proportionate share. And in order to answer the question, what is a group's proportionate share, you have to have the information that I provided in the last presentation, which is what is their proportion of the United States population. So if you think about the majority group in the U.S., which are whites of European descent, they are about 64% of the population. Then if they have more than 64% of all educational credentials rewarded, if they, are more than 64% of the wealth, if they hold more than 64% of the political power positions in our country, we would say that they have a disproportionate share. And if they have a disproportionate share, that means that those extra shares came from other groups which now mean they are underrepresented, right? They also have a disproportionate share, but it's because instead of being overrepresented in these kind of advantages, they are underrepresented. And so this is why it's significant that even though we project by 2050 that whites will numerically no longer be the majority group, like it will be a country comprised of minority groups in a higher percentage than the majority group in terms of population. That doesn't mean that they won't still be the majority group if they still have this disproportionately overrepresentation across these multiple criteria. A sort of example here of another country where the majority group has historically, traditionally been not the numerical majority is Africa. I mean, South Africa. Which we talked about in the presentation when I talked about caste systems. So because during the apartheid system and then later even post-apartheid, for a very long time, the white Afrikaners were the majority group. They were the dominant group, although numerically they were, of course, a minority. So if you see here, the word privilege here is in bright blue because this is a term that we are introducing in this topic because we talked about social status in the last learning module, right? That esteem, that prestige that society assigns you because of who you are. So under social status, there is this term privilege. And, there's how you might use this term or how you might see this term used in social media where it's become very, kind of a part of call out culture to tell people to check their privilege or oh, your privilege is showing. And that's a debate for another day, another class. But in academia, this isn't a trendy term. Like it's been in existence for a very long while. Probably our best definition comes from Peggy McIntosh, who gave examples of first white privilege and then later male privilege and then later heterosexual privilege. In her writing. And so this was a article that she wrote quite a while ago, and it was called White Privilege Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And this was, a great article for conceptualizing this idea of privilege. And I'm going to use the definition that she provides in this article. And it is that privilege is like an invisible knapsack of unearned advantages that a person can call upon when needed. And so kind of a couple of key things there in that definition is invisible. Oftentimes we don't think about the privilege that we have. Like we can clearly see the privileges we don't have, but the privileges we have are often invisible to us, right? So if you can walk around holding your significant other's hand, regardless of where you're at, then that's probably because you're heterosexual, and in almost all spaces you can openly be affectionate with your heterosexual partner in a way that homosexual partnerships aren't necessarily free to be. If you can go and feel confident that most of your children's books and toys and media are going to reflect their race, then that's the type of privilege of being part of the majority group in this country that's white that people that aren't of that race don't necessarily have. I'm older, so I came of age long before there were really any princesses of color. Princess Jasmine, maybe by the time I was, a little older, but then certainly all the other princesses, Moana and the princess from The Princess and the Frog, all of those princesses came much later. And so princesses were still popular back then, but when I was invited to a princess party, when I was little, I was often reminded that, in popular media, there were no brown princesses. There was no one who looked like me in Disney movies, which always made it a little bit sadder for me when we would have events as little kids that would involve dressing up like your favorite Disney character, right? So, some things are big, some things are small. And if you're interested, you can certainly Google Peggy McIntosh and look at the list that she has. It's several pages long. But it's that idea that you take your privilege for granted, and that those things that society is giving you, the things that society is affording you, the opportunities, the lack of barriers, the things that just kind of make your life simple and easy that you don't have to think about, it's unearned, right? It's not necessarily becoming because you're a good person or you're hardworking or you're smart. Like, these are things that really just exist because of the race that you are, or the sex that you are, or the sexual orientation that you are. And so this idea of privilege builds on two other ideas from two other sociologists, one of which is, once again, a concept that pops up in social media, intersectionality. And that's the idea that we have multiple statuses, which you should remember from chapter 4, and that some of those statuses are privileged and some of those statuses are disadvantaged. And so therefore, we have these statuses that intersect, so that our lived experience is kind of experiencing simultaneously these range of statuses, right? So I don't necessarily go through my day experiencing it as African American, or as a woman, or as upper middle class, or as heterosexual, right? But instead, in fact, it's all of these statuses that intersect, that shape my experience. I am all of these things. And some of these things I am societally like more disadvantaged, so in regards to race and gender, and in some of these things I am societally advantaged, socioeconomic status and sexual orientation. And that reflects, Patricia Hill Collins, another sociologist, her concept of the matrix of domination, right? That there is this web of statuses where some are dominant and some are subordinate. And so, in general, I don't condone playing what I call oppression Olympics. Who's suffered the most and who's in the wrong and whose life is harder. With intersectionality, people's lives can be uniquely hard. Depending on your status, maybe it's harder in one context and easier in another, and vice versa. But the other thing that I just want to be clear here is, as sociologists, we're interested in how society creates barriers or opportunities for you based on status, which means we aren't necessarily promising that your life is going to be easy and great just because you are perhaps privileged across the board, right? You could still be an unhappy person. You can still be a horrible person that no one likes. You can still have your heart broken. You can still have tragedies happen to you, because none of those things are societal, right? Some of those things are luck. Some of those things are on the individual level. The key thing with the concept of privilege and then the related concepts of intersectionality and the matrix of domination is that, in regards to your status in society, sometimes you have unearned advantages and sometimes you have unearned disadvantages. And most of us are living our lives, experiencing a unique mix of both at the same time. And so this brings me to the kind of definition here of minority groups. These are the groups in society that, instead of benefiting from social status and privilege, they are more likely to experience a pattern of disadvantage or inequality. Keyword here is pattern. You might experience an occasional disadvantage, some bad service, somewhere someone talks bad about you, someone mistreats you. The key thing about minority groups is that this is a pattern. It is across multiple contexts and multiple interactions. It's not one-offs. Usually minority groups share a visible trait that differentiates them in some way, makes it clear that they're not part of the majority. Because of this, they are a self-conscious social unit. And when I say self-conscious, I don't necessarily mean self-conscious like, I'm so embarrassed, don't look at me. I mean self-conscious in the sense of they because they are treated differently, seen differently as the majority group, they think about themselves as being unique and separate from the majority group. And that is what that little graphic on this slide tries to indicate, is that kind of the further away you are from being part of the majority, of having power, as being seen as like similar to the national identity, not experiencing discrimination, the more heightened your sense is of being part of the minority. And so, because they are this self conscious social unit, this is oftentimes why, like I said in the last presentation, there is this pressure to. There's this pressure to identify as being minority when you are, of minority descent, even if you're multiracial. And so historically, there's also been, these are the groups that there are laws that prevent, anti-miscegenation laws to prevent intermarriage with. So these charts that your book gives about economic well-being, income extremes, education, really these are the numbers that just try to reflect the ways in which, when we say that the majority group is advantaged in respect to other groups, like these are some of the criteria we're looking at, right? We're trying to see, do these numbers reflect, who it does have better access to the good stuff at the top of the stratification ladder. The rest of this presentation is going to focus a little bit more closely or specifically on that part of the minority group experience where I said they experience pattern a pattern of inequality or unequal treatment. So for the rest of the slides or the rest of this presentation, we're going to be talking through the concepts of racism, prejudice, and discrimination. So, first of all, when I introduced the concept racism, this is very similar to privilege in the sense, in the academic space, there is a very precise definition that we use. The term racist or racism has a lot of power in this country because most people do not want to be accused of racism. I would say there probably are some people that are perfectly fine with being accused of being racist, but a lot of people, don't want to face that accusation, and a lot of people lob that accusation, not necessarily precisely. At least in the academic sense of the word. So, with racism, academically, we talk about it as being the belief that one racial group is inferior to another, a belief that is further upheld by the practices of the dominant group to maintain the inferior position of the dominated group. And so sometimes this can be kind of just it can be captured as the equation that racism is a combination of power plus prejudice plus discrimination. This is, of course, a contested definition. It's contested in the sense that this doesn't always align with how the average layperson uses the term. And it's also contested in the sense that academics themselves sometimes debate back and forth about, is this what racism really is? And usually the part that is contested is that idea about power, right? And that that because it isn't just that you think a group is inferior, and it's not even that you treat someone like they are inferior, but the fact that you have the ability to build a system that then largely keeps that group of people in its place does mean that only the dominant and majority group can be racist under that definition. Certainly, people of color, minority groups can be hateful, and we'll talk about that, but that's prejudice. And they certainly can also be discriminatory. They can treat people differently. It really relates back to do they have the ability to create an entire system where they then try to keep another group down? And for the most part, the answer there is no. There aren't such spaces that exist in the United States where minority groups are so very much in power that they can kind of create this mini society where they're able to kind of lob this type of power. But the individual components that go into racism, prejudice, and discrimination, as you can see here, those exist on the individual level, which means anyone can be prejudiced, anyone can be discriminatory. At the group or societal level, which is ideological racism and institutional discrimination, that goes beyond the individual. We won't be talking explicitly about ideological racism and how that's slightly different than racism in this particular class. I will be introducing the distinction between discrimination and institutional discrimination in the upcoming slides. But before we get into these terms, one thing that I want to clarify from the beginning is that part of America, not America, but really the world's kind of interest, obsession in this concept of race, from the very beginning was tinged by racism, right? This sense that there are people better than others. And of course, as the last presentation explained, we now are very much aware that there is no biological basis of race, but we did not know that at the time. And when we look at the earliest racial classification system, which I give you a look at right there, it is by Linnaeus. And Carl Linnaeus he was a Swedish biologist, zoologist, right? That's largely what he studied. And he offered this classification system of the races. And so, if you look at his descriptions, right, that the Homo sapiens americano were red, ill-tempered, and subjugated. The Homo sapiens asiaticus were yellow, melancholy, and greedy. The Homo sapiens afur were black, impassive, and lazy. The Homo sapiens europaeus were white, serious, and strong. I think just looking at this totally objective, and I'm saying that with sarcasm, classification, you can probably guess which group Linnaeus belonged to. And so, almost from the beginning of this concept of race, there has been this partnering with it of prejudice, of prejudging people on the basis of race and assuming to them or assuming to their group like holistic characteristics. And this is exactly what prejudice is. It's basically a judgment or attitude or opinion that's formed before the facts are known. Oftentimes, these opinions are based on suspicion, intolerance, and irrational hatred of other races, religions, creeds, nationalities. There's all types of prejudice. You can be prejudiced against people that wear glasses. You can be prejudiced against tall people. You can be prejudiced against redheads, right? It's the idea that you take a characteristic and because of that characteristic, you make all these other prejudgments, assumptions about that person, and you don't necessarily give them the opportunity to kind of exist as who they really are. And so prejudice exists in the minds and hearts of people, right? So it's how people think, it's how people feel. Now, one specific form of cognitive prejudice is stereotyping. And stereotyping is basically when you apply a generalization to all or most members of a group. You basically assign the members of that group a characteristic. And you don't necessarily give a lot of flexibility in regards to differences and variation, right? And so this is true. Even if the stereotype you are implying, even if it's something that you're like, but that's a positive thing. So if you're like, Asians are smart at math and African Americans are good at basketball, or Latinos are hardworking, the problem there is, once again, that prejudgment is taking place on the basis of a characteristic, and then you are broadly applying this characteristic across groups. And it is very hard. It's very easy, to catch yourself applying a stereotype, because people who study stereotypes, it's a form of cognitive shortcut. You take one thing that you know about a person, that's easily distinguishable, something like race or something like gender, and then you associate it with other characteristics that are maybe less recognizable, and then you kind of apply those two hand in hand. And that's why, in order for stereotyping to even exist, there has to be a grain of truth, right? There's a reason why when I said, African Americans are good at basketball, you might be like, but they are, right? Because you're thinking maybe about the NBA or who the great players were in your high school. If I would have said something that didn't align with any visible examples, like African Americans are great bagpipe players, like this stereotype would fall flat. But the thing about stereotypes is there is no all blanks are blank. There are always exceptions to the rule. Sometimes so many exceptions to the rule that the rule shouldn't even be a rule. And so that's why it's important to push yourself to not rely on stereotypes when evaluating or assessing people or getting to know people or meet people, because you don't really know a person just because you know some characteristics about them. And so, as sociologists, we, try to measure prejudice, try to measure people's use of stereotypes. It has gotten a lot harder in the post 70s world because people are less likely to tell researchers if they do hate people of certain groups or if they do think badly of people of certain groups. It was a lot easier to get this data in the 50s and the 60s where people were more forthcoming about their prejudices. But there are several ways that sociologists still go about doing it. So this is what you're seeing here is a chart that was asking people their associations with of competence, as well as how likely they would be to want to spend time with people of these groups. And so what you're seeing is a mixture of competence assessments and warmth assessments. And you can see that there's some groups that people both measure their competence as being low and they don't want to associate with them, the homeless, welfare recipients. And then there are people, groups that are in the middle, moderate, medium, moderate level competence, moderate level warmth. There are people that they are measured as being high warmth, high competence. And so all of this, right, because when they're asking these questions, people didn't even necessarily know people in all of these groups, but it was largely kind of based on, kind of their stereotypes of these groups and maybe any prejudices they might have about them. Another way in which we try to capture prejudice is by doing a little content analysis. So, because I used to teach in Bakersfield, I always used to like to share this study with students. It was put out by Tolerance in America, and I give you the link there. But this is based on the analysis of 12 million tweets between June 2014 and December 2015. And even though I'm highlighting the anti-Hispanic tweets here, it's worth noting they did this for multiple races, they did this for gender, they did this for sexual orientation, transgender. So if you follow the link, you can look at some of the other analysis. But basically, they were just looking at, the tweets that were containing slurs against Hispanic and Latino people, and then there you see the ratio. At the very end of this chapter, the last presentation, when we talk about where do we go from here, there is a discussion of contact theory, and the idea that if people came into contact with people of other groups, that this might foster, more tolerance and warmth. But certainly something like this study kind of pushes back against that a little bit, because as you can see, the place where we see the most anti-Hispanic tweets per 100,000 tweets is California. And it's important to say per 100,000 because California is a huge state. So if it was just looking at raw numbers, it would probably have the most anyway. But the fact that it's per 100,000 is allowing us to capture rate. And so then if you look at it by city, the first 5 cities are all in California, and in Bakersfield, where I used to teach, is at the very top, which is not surprising. And then later there is another California city there, even in the top 10. So we're always working to kind of capture how are people thinking and feeling? But some people are like, if people are thinking and feeling, hateful things but not acting on it, is it really that big of a deal? And it's worth noting that not every prejudiced person is discriminatory. Um, and sometimes people who are discriminatory aren't even necessarily motivated explicitly by prejudice. And that's why we treat these concepts as separate things. So, what is discrimination? It is the failure to treat people in the same way. Usually, it's because of a bias towards some of them. Because of some characteristic, such as race, religion, sex, national origin. But the key thing is you're treating them differently in such a way, and it shouldn't matter for that particular thing. So, the a sport like volleyball or a sport like basketball, where there is real advantages to being tall, although obviously there are some exceptional short players in both. But there are real advantages to being tall. So if someone is picking a basketball team and they are primarily focusing on tall people who can play versus short people who can play, that isn't necessarily the type of thing that we would call discriminatory. Likewise, if I am looking to purchase breast milk for my newborn baby because my milk didn't come in. Once again, the fact that I limit it to lactating individuals isn't me being discriminatory. It is the nature of what I'm looking for. However, if I offer extra credit to only the women in my class, that is discriminatory. Right? There is no reason why there should only be extra credit offered to one segment of the class. So discrimination is behavior, right? It is behavior. And there are two different types of discrimination. Individual discrimination, which I just want you to know, individual can also mean a group of individuals, right? So if your fraternity or sorority refuses to accept people of another race, even though that is there is a group of you doing it, we still consider that to be individual discrimination. And that's because institutional discrimination is discrimination that's been enshrined in law, public policy, or common practice, societal common practice. And it's embedded in the routine operation of major social institutions. It's present in businesses, schools, hospitals, and government, right? So, you know, individual group level discrimination is what people do to one another, and because it's at the individual level, this means this type of discrimination can be practiced by people of color as whites. Once again, because of the power dynamic in this society, which could be very different in another society where another group of people might be in power. But here in this society, it historically and currently is still people white of European descent. So the institutionalized discrimination that exists was created through policies by that group. And those policies exist to either reward people of their group or to make things disproportionately harder and create barriers to people that were not of their group. And there are several examples that commonly are given for institutionalized discrimination. A very popular one that has once again had some light shined on it because of the most recent Supreme Court case is legacy admissions, particularly at private institutions. It was like over two-thirds of white students at Harvard were there because of legacy admissions. Legacy admissions are considered institutionalized discrimination because of who was actually permitted to attend those schools 1, 2 generations ago. Most legacy admissions are strengthened by every single generation that attended that school. It is very rare that you will find a person of color that can call upon legacy admissions to any school outside of a minority serving institution further than 1 generation, right? So, I mean, not that legacy matters necessarily at UNC Chapel Hill, but my parents both went there, so I'm legacy. But my grandparents certainly did not go there because North Carolina at the time was segregated, and the only colleges that black people could go to were the ones for black students. So it was not an option for them to go to a school like UNC 2 generations ago, let alone a school like Harvard. So legacy admissions, by virtue of who was even admitted 100 years ago, is a way to give an unfair advantage to people who benefited from policies that existed back then. Redlining, I will go into more detail about in the next upcoming slides, as well as subprime lending. The war on drugs, this is a callback to the chapter from deviance in the criminal justice system. The kind of big example there is, of course, is that crack versus cocaine disparity, relying on the stereotypes, as well as just the statistics of who was more likely to be doing coke versus who was more likely to be doing crack. There was that 1 to 100 disparity in sentencing, which meant that you would have to have a whole lot of coke in order to get the same type of sentence that a person could have for a very little bit of crack, which objectively, if the issue is drug usage, if drugs are against the law, then the kind of logic underlying that policy falls apart as to why there would be this 100 times difference if it wasn't necessarily related to race and as well as social class. But we're going to spend a little bit more time on the housing examples. But before we get there, we're going to be talking about all of these court cases, laws, policies in presentations 3 and 4. But this is while we're talking about institutional discrimination, I would be remiss to not point out that our country has policies, laws, Supreme Court decisions that pretty much made discrimination legal, permissible. Obviously, slavery, in which from the very beginning, the whole Three-Fifths Compromise that introduced this idea that slaves weren't even to be counted as full people. Plessy versus Ferguson, which pretty much made it clear that, the Constitution, the rights inscribed in the Constitution did not extend to slavery, to slaves. Jim Crow laws, which at the time of them passing, these were the kind of whites only, blacks only, the de jure segregation laws that pretty much were enshrined in most parts of the South post-Reconstruction era. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first time we explicitly prevented immigration on the basis of nation of origin. And we'll talk about that more, but a lot of that was related to prejudice against the Chinese immigrants who had come to America to help build a railroad. The Immigration Act of 1924, which it just outlined quotas, giving a lot more spots to European nations, particularly Western European nations, than it did to Eastern European nations, and did not give any spots at all to South American, Asian American, or African countries. And then Japanese internment camps, which once again, we'll talk about that more in presentation 4, but during World War II, the rounding up of Japanese and Japanese Americans and placing them in internment camps for the duration of the war. So these are literally social policies that were passed by the government that would be considered discriminatory. But moving beyond the government to how institutional discrimination can take place in other places. For the next 2 slides, I want to focus specifically on how the consequences of prejudice and racial discrimination can impact housing and the wealth gap. So we talked about, for most Americans, if they have any wealth, it is probably because they own a home. So home ownership is very important in this country. And if you look at the wealth gap that exists between whites and black non-Hispanics and Hispanics, you see that there is this sizable gap between, and it's remained pretty constant, and it's actually even increased during more recent years, largely due to the recession. And so, not all of this, but certainly some of this is due to policies that are now pretty much considered to be examples of institutional discrimination, one of which is redlining and the other of which is subprime mortgages. So, redlining refers to a practice that back when there was no internet and people largely just went to their local bank, banks would have a map of their area on the wall, and in areas in that they felt like were safe to loan to, those areas would be marked in green. And in areas they felt like it was not safe for them to to loan to, those areas would be marked in red. For a lot of places, that usually came down to areas that were lower income, areas that were predominantly minority were redlined. And this impacted a lot of several things. First of all, it impacted the ability of the people who live there themselves to get mortgage loans or even small business loans. It also helped contribute to these areas remaining largely segregated until gentrification has now made these places more desirable as people just seek land. But before that, it made it hard to integrate these areas because if you were a member of the majority group and you were like, but you know what? I don't care who my neighbors are. I found a great deal and I would like to live in this block. Or you're like, you know what? I think that I would like to put my restaurant or my store there, then you might would find yourself stymied by the bank because at this point it doesn't matter your own individual lack of prejudice. The bank would either flat out prevent you from getting a loan there, or because is a redlined area, they would offer you a loan with a much higher interest rate, which at that point it's not necessarily prejudice for you to turn down that loan. So much as it is rational thinking. So the green areas became the growth areas in a city. They became the growth areas in a state, and usually these were the areas that had lower concentrations of minorities. So this is how, especially in cities like Chicago, cities like DC, cities like New York, even, that they had these kind of areas that were largely minority and then were also kind of entrenched poverty. Now, if you happen to live in that area and you were a minority, in some cases it wasn't just that they would deny you flat out a mortgage loan, but the likelihood that they would offer you what we call a kind of subprime loan, right? Where it is this loan that with this ridiculously high APR and is set up so that you're mainly just paying off the interest before you're paying on the principal. And it was a way for the bank to make as much money as they possibly can, knowing that they were pretty much setting this person up to eventually default on the loan, and they would lose their home. But usually the banks would have made would have made some money off of them before this happened, and then of course the bank would also just get the home back and be able to sell it. And so this is a slide from your textbook, which shows that, even when incomes are similar, that whites are less likely to be denied a mortgage than Latinos and African Americans, whether they are above the median income or below the median income, and that Latinos and African Americans, when offered a mortgage, were charged a much higher interest rate. This isn't legal, and part of why banks collect this information, they're supposed to collect this information, is because the government regularly holds audits to see to what extent that this is going on. And so whenever it is found that a bank has engaged in this type of discrimination, then usually they are forced to do kind of a class action lawsuit or payout. And although this wasn't explicit to home loans, it is there has been several car lenders in the last couple of years who have post audit been discovered that they were charging higher interest rates on car loans to their minority customers than their majority customers, and they had to pay a payout. So, for example, in 2016, Ally Financial, which is the main financing arm for General Motors, was forced to pay $80 million back to customers of color, and this included blacks, Asians, as well as Latinos, when it was determined that they were charged higher interest rates on their car loans than white customers with the same income and credit scores. In addition, they had to pay $18 million in fees. I'm well aware of this case because I used to have a car loan with Ally Financial, and unbeknownst to me, at the time I got the loan and was offered my rate and just accepted it and paid it, that, perhaps if I was the exact same person with the exact same credit and income profile, I would have gotten a lower rate if my race was different. Once again, this also kind of goes back to how I started this chapter off, which is all of Ally Financial's white customers who benefited by receiving a lower APR. They didn't necessarily know that they benefited. They didn't ask for it, right? This is in essence how privilege works, right? It was an unearned asset that was given to them. That doesn't make them bad people, but this is part of why we study and measure and try to capture these things, because how would you know that a company was doing that if there weren't audits that prove that these types of things happen? And so this is once again just another thing of what I mean when I say that race is not biologically real, but is still very much sociologically relevant, and it's why people still study it. How this can play out sometimes in job discrimination. So I am giving you two links to specifically studies done by sociologists that try to prove that racial discrimination exists in jobs. It has been illegal to discriminate on the basis of race in the employment sector for, since the 60s. So very few people flat out say, I don't hire someone because of the race they are. But yet this is oftentimes the sense that people have, right? Sometimes that they are experiencing racial discrimination when applying for jobs. But having that sense and being able to prove it are not the same things. So in sociology, I think I said this like way back when in chapter 1, we aren't big on doing experiments, like creating these totally kind of false settings and situations to kind of measure what people would do. But there is a kind of quasi experiment that is popular with sociologists, and they call these audit studies. So in audit studies, you are trying to see what really happens in the real world. And you're doing this by kind of introducing a kind of false element in the sense of you're creating fake applicants or fake applications or sending out fake resumes, but you're presenting them as if they are real in order to gauge what an employer's real response would be. So there are kind of two studies that I like to highlight here. The first one that I'm going to talk about is actually the black name study that's what it's sometimes called. It was by Bertrand and Mullin-Nathan. They are from the University of Chicago or MIT at the time they did the study. So they created these resumes, and the resumes were 100% identical, except some of the resumes had stereotypically white names, Jessicas and Thomases, and some of the resumes had stereotypical black names, Tanishas and Jamals. And they then sent the resumes out. So what they discovered were the white names got one callback per 10 resumes, and the black names got one callback per 15. So this is a 50% increase for identical resumes just on the basis of name. So then they were like, okay, well maybe these were for entry level positions. They were like, okay, but maybe race will matter even less if it's a higher quality resume, right? If we give this person additional education and credentials. So when they then gave the person a even better resume, this increased the white sounding name callback by 30%. So now it's an 80% callback. But it only got blacks an additional 9%. Um, so once again, they kind of had some conclusions about, what this kind of suggests. Um, Especially since in a lot of times, people's credentials aren't 100% equal, but even when they are equal, and even when they're higher quality, the kind of significance that race takes on, or race, or people's assumptions about race, like based on name. Even more well-known study was done in the early aughts and then replicated several times throughout the aughts by a sociologist named Deva Pager, and then she later partnered with Bruce Western. And they did the study first in Wisconsin, Madison area, and then they then performed it later in New York. And those are the results that I give you there. And I give you the link to the New York Times article about it. So basically, they hired undergraduates to portray themselves as being job applicants. And for some of those job applications, they needed to also indicate that they were an ex-convict, that they served time for a minor, a minor drug charge. So they would put in their application for these entry level jobs. For some time, for some of the jobs, they would indicate that they had this drug charge. Then for some of them, they indicated they wouldn't. They'd put a phone number on that fake application, and that phone number wasn't attached to their real phones. It was attached to a call bank, and literally they just measured the calls that came in. Unsurprisingly, the fact that whites who don't have a criminal record had the highest callback numbers wasn't a huge surprise. What became the kind of surprising takeaway in both the Madison as well as the New York location is the fact that whites who had a criminal record were even slightly preferred in terms of callback than blacks who had a criminal record, 17 to 14%. And for blacks who did have a criminal record, their callback for these entry level jobs was only 5%. And so this case or this study is cited for two reasons. First of all, is cited for its implications about racial discrimination in employment. But then it also is cited in a lot of criminology classes, criminal justice studies, because if you think about the number of people, especially African Americans and Latinos, that were arrested during the war on drugs for low-level drug charges, if no one is willing to employ them when they are released, and they will be released and have been released because people don't remain in jail forever for low-level drug charges, but if people won't hire them and give them a fresh chance, then it makes it easier to understand why the recidivism rates are what they are. And so this study has a lot of significance for people who are interested in both things. People that are interested in racial discrimination in employment, as well as people who are interested in kind of the treatment of people who have served time in jail and recidivism and what's needed for prisoner reentry back into society. The kind of final consequence of racism, of racial prejudice, I want to talk about is hate crimes. So if someone is conducting a hate crime, this is taking prejudice is taking prejudice to kind of its ultimate application, right? And hate crimes are crimes that are motivated by prejudice. In our country, we have federal hate crime legislation that particularly protects against race, religion, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation. And hate crimes aren't just directed at the individual, they also exist to kind of serve a warning to the larger group. And so, in this way, hate crimes can also be seen as an act of terrorism. And so, in presentation three, when we talk about the role of lynching, when we're talking about African Americans, I want you to kind of keep that in mind. The lynchings themselves were largely hate crimes, but it wasn't just to punish or to terrorize the person it was enacted on. It also was a way to terrorize the entire group that person was from. And first of all, it's just this isn't new in our society. Hate crimes, long before we were calling them hate crimes, they existed, and they're certainly not all reported. They have increasingly included the gay community in addition to the other communities I've already listed, which is why there has been a push to include sexual orientation as a protected group on hate crime legislation. And that hate crimes and groups are not limited to any one region. So this is a map of active hate groups in the U.S. back in 2010. As you can see, although we do have our fair share of groups in the South, particularly in the deeper South, you can also see that Eastern Texas has its fair amount, and Southern California has had a lot of recent growth of hate crime groups. So all of these things that I've talked about are kind of exist on how individuals of minority groups themselves, how they can experience prejudice, how they can experience discrimination, whether on the individual or the institutional level, their experience of hate crimes. The very end of this presentation, I want to focus on what does this mean for us as a country. So America is now close to being classified as a majority minority country, meaning that the majority of people in this country will be a minority, a member of a minority group in the future. Like I said, it seems like somewhere between 2045, 2050 is when they expect this to happen. And we know that this has already happened in some states. Those are the states you see in blue. We expect it to happen within the next 10 to 15 years. In other states, those are the states that you see in green. North Carolina is one of those. And so when we reach this point, as our minority populations continue to grow, what does the future hold in terms of majority minority relations? Your book goes over several options, four of which are probably less likely, given where we are today as a country, hopefully as a nation. And the final two, assimilation and multiculturalism, this is actually where a lot of sociologists and academics kind of spend time debating about which one is preferable, which one is more likely. But I'll go over all six. So, first of which, of course, is genocide. This is literally when you kill off all members of a group. It has happened here in the United States. A lot of people argue that what we did to the Native Americans largely amounts to genocide. It has certainly happened in other countries. The Holocaust was a genocide. Rwanda experienced a genocide. Population transfer, or also called expulsion. This is where you basically remove a group and relocate them somewhere else. For the Native American population that managed to survive the first 100, 200, 250 years of European arrival in the U.S., this was their eventual outcome, right? They were removed, the Indian Removal Act, and they were relocated to the middle of the country and placed on reservations where they largely remained until 1970, where we started to see a larger exodus of Native American identifying people off the reservation, although reservations still exist today. Internal colonialism. In this case, and this is lesser known, but you can say that this is more of what Mexican Americans experienced when the United States, after annexing Texas and then fighting with Mexico in the Spanish American War, we then wound up with the rest of the Southwest. we'll talk about this further when we talk about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but basically an agreement was reached that Mexicans that were currently in those lands would not be forced to leave their family ancestral lands, that they can remain in America without becoming citizens, but they would be treated as, they would be treated fairly, equitably, and we'll talk about to what extent that did or didn't happen. But that is the example to use of internal colonialism. When you allow a group to stay, you don't kill them, you don't relocate them, but you don't treat them as full citizens. You basically you treat them as if they are beneath the dominant group, even if you do not go as far as segregating them. And of course, segregation by law was the law of the land of most of the states in the South well into the 1960s and the 1970s. So as I stated, as our country becomes even more of a majority minority country, don't expect those first four to really be an option of where we are going. Instead, it is assimilation and multiculturalism that academics kind of focus on as being a possibility. Assimilation, this is where you're absorbed into the dominant culture. We saw this happen successfully with most white European ethnics, that they arrived on America's shores as immigrants from Italy or Ireland or England or Germany. And with each generation, their ties to their home countries got less and less significant, and they kind of just blended in to the majority group. The image that we have of this is the melting pot, right? A bunch of, I don't know, cheeses melting into a delightful new mixture of cheese. And assimilation was largely seen as being the ideal until maybe around the 60s and the 70s, because around this time, not only did the immigrants that we started receiving, not only did they become less European, but this is also kind of the beginnings of the civil rights movement, and just the question of, will African Americans ever truly be accepted, embraced by the larger society in the same way that white European ethnics were. And so this competing goal of multiculturalism, sometimes called pluralism, was put out instead, that people can retain their unique ethnic racial identity while still being part of the positive national unified whole, right? So this is that idea of hyphenated Americans, right? The emphasis being we are all Americans, but who we are before the hyphen, that might not necessarily go away, that it might still matter generation after generation. And so instead of the melting pot image for this, I want you to think about the salad bowl, right? So with a salad, it's made up of many different ingredients, but whatever you put whenever you're eating your salad, it's not like you question, what is this that's in my mouth? Is it a cucumber? Is it a tomato? Is it a carrot? I don't know. No, I mean, the individual ingredients of your salad, but you appreciate that jointly the ingredients come together to make a great salad. And metaphorically, for people that support multiculturalism, the multiculturalism model, that's what they're saying, that African Americans might remain African Americans, and Latinos remain Latinos, and Native Americans remain Native Americans. But the emphasis there being on that kind of shared American identity while still maintaining their own separate racial ethnic identity. And this is just a helpful chart from your book that kind of explains and gives examples of all of these different options. And so as we get ready, as I wrap up presentation 2, another long one, we're going to head into presentations 3 and 4, where in order to understand racial stratification better, we need to address both the past and the present of different racial ethnic groups in our country. So presentation 3 will tackle whites, Native Americans, African Americans, and presentation 4 I will discuss immigration, Latinos, Asian American Pacific Islanders, as well as Middle Eastern Arab Americans. And that is it for this presentation.